Tonight, the Lord didn't put a real deep teaching on my heart. What he put on my heart was going back to the basics, understanding the basics of what we're supposed to do as believers. And tonight, I want to begin with a quote from a Jewish musician by the name of Yahu. And on one of his albums, he makes this quote. At that time, referring to the time of King David, we could have a real understanding of a king. For us, we do not know so much as what is a kingdom or a king. We live in a world of fragmentation, where the majority of people do not appreciate or care about the person that is running things. At that time, the king was the people. The king was the people, meaning that all of the people were part of the king, and the king loved the people with his whole heart. He would do anything for them. He was not just a politician. He was a warrior, a general on the front lines. He would die for his people. He was a singer, a writer, a poet, all of these different things, and he was a real person. And after the Lord showed me this quote, he sent me to Revelation chapter 22, verse 5. In the complete Jewish Bible, it reads, "Night will no longer exist, so they will need neither light from a lamp nor the light from the sun, because Adonai God will shine upon them, and they will reign as kings forever." And that made me think, what kind of king am I going to be? Made me think, what kind of king am I right now? Because like a king, I can influence people. My actions can influence people. My decisions can influence people. My decisions, they can change someone else's life. When I was in youth ministry, I had a theory that the person you are when you're behind the wheel of a car, alone, by yourself, with no consequences, that is truly the person that you are. Whether you have road rage, or whether you yell at people, or whether you pray or sing, whichever you are, that's truly the person you are without consequences. And I used to tell these kids that you don't know whose life you're influencing at any given moment. You could cut someone off in traffic, and how do you know that that person that you just cut off, that wasn't their last straw? And how do you know that person isn't going to go into the grocery store and argue or gripe at that cashier who isn't her last straw? And how do you know that that cashier isn't going to go home and fight with her husband that night and it's his last straw and that marriage ends? We don't know, because we're called to be greater than that. We're called to be more. We shouldn't be so aggressive and so angry and let this world completely consume us that we become another person than who we are right here and right now. So I had to take a really hard look in the mirror, because I'm not outside of the boundaries of what God's trying to instruct. When he's teaching me to teach you, he is truly teaching me. I'm only sharing the instruction that he put on my heart. So I had to start looking at what kind of king I would be. So who else to go to but King David? He was the man after God's own heart. If I'm going to find out who a king is, what it means to be a king in this world, then I need to go to the king that God gave to the people. In 1 Samuel 16 it says, "Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king from amongst his sons." Going down to verse 13, it says, Then Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. What set David apart? What made him different than all of his other brothers? What made him different from everyone else in Israel? What made him so unique that God chose him as a shepherd boy to lead an entire nation? David, he loved the people with his whole heart, just like Matisyahu said in his quote. He loved them with his whole heart. He showed loving kindness to his people. He even showed loving kindness to his enemies. He let God handle his problems. He didn't try and impose upon other people, or he didn't try and impose that authority. He's a king. He can make huge decisions on his own, but yet he waited for God's prophet to lead him and guide him. David also had a repentant heart. You can count the countless times, or try to count the countless times that David was repentant on his mistakes. David knew when he made a mistake, and he wasn't so full of pride that he wasn't afraid to go to God and beg and plead for forgiveness. So when I'm looking at myself, trying to line myself up with someone like King David, which seems to be an impossibility. It's almost like comparing yourself to Yeshua or living up to that type of person. I have to look at my upbringing. I have to look at my mom, and I have to look at my dad. And I have to understand who they are as people. I have to understand what makes them tick. Because what makes them tick is what makes me tick. And now that I look back on it, and the Lord had me look back on my upbringing, they did a pretty good job with who they had to work with. I mean, they really, if anybody was a tester of patience, it was I. But I'm here now. I'm doing this now, instead of doing what I was doing then. I've overcome all of those obstacles and all of those things that the devil put in my way, and God prevailed in my life. So I was the same as most of the children, most of your children. I was the child that ignored his parents. I didn't listen, didn't want to listen. I knew what was best for me. I am not going to listen to this. I will do what I want to do, and I'm not going to listen. I admit that now. I would never admit that then. But understand that even though your children are not hearing you, they're listening. They're hearing everything that you say. They absorb it. And most doctors and psychologists believe that a child's developmental years are from the ages of 2 to 5 years old. So while you're trying to work out what being a parent is, by the time you get it figured out, your child's already past the point of their growth. They've already figured out who they're going to be by the time you figure out what you're doing. I look at that as one of God's little jokes. But you have to be careful, and I'm going to go back to the in-the-car type of situation, that in-the-car moment where you're driving along and somebody cuts you off and you have a few choice words. I may not have been the person who had a few choice words, but I would certainly have a statement or two for them. As my mom and my stepdad were driving here today, I realized that I got that from them. Because I'm listening to them on the phone as they're driving. Oh, come on, get out of my way. What's the matter with you? Who taught you how to drive? Those situations, that's me. That's what I do. That's what I do when I drive. So, Micah, when she was about 2, her car seat is directly behind the driver's seat. So, you can easily get lost in her not being there. Forgetting, getting caught up in the moment, and the 2-year-old with the absorbent, sponge-like brain is sitting behind you. And one day I hear murmuring and talking, and she's just learning to talk, and I'm hearing these things coming from the back seat. And I look in the rearview mirror, and I see her pointing at traffic and yelling at cars. And I realized at that moment that I taught her that. The way I drive taught her that. Now, Jada, on the other hand, she was different because Misty and I had kind of corrected ourselves by the time Jada came around. Now, Jada kind of just sings along with the music, and Misty turns the music up loud enough that the kids can't hear what she's saying to other cars. That's wisdom. But in my upbringing, my mom told me lots of stories. When I got curious about who my grandfather was, my mom would tell me stories about my grandfather. He was a preacher. He was a man of God. He died when I was 2 years old, so I didn't have a chance to get to know him. But through my mom's stories, I did get a chance to know him. And she would tell stories about Grandpa when he would preach, that he would point out different things that my mom may have been doing during the service, or point out the things that she had done maybe during the week. And he would prove a point by using analogies from his own life at home. But when Mom would tell these stories, although they were funny to us, humorous, you could see behind her eyes that there was hurt there. There was resentment. And it was one of those moments where I was hearing, and later on I would be listening. Because now I have girls of my own. Now I'm standing in the place that my grandfather was standing, and I have a choice. Do I pick on my family to prove a point? My choice is no. I'm not going to do that. Because it hurt my mom. And I can make a decision that changes my family's life. I can correct that mistake. I can make it right. So I chose to use stories of my family, of where my children have blessed me. Where my children, through the childlike faith, has changed my life. And there's no story greater than the one of bringing Jasmine home from the hospital. When Jasmine was born, she was born in the afternoon, and it just so happened that on that day, there were more children born in that hospital than there were ever before. There were so many children born that there was not enough room in the nursery for Jasmine to go and for them to do all the tests and the blood work and the shots and all of that stuff that needed to be done. They didn't even take her out of the room to give her a bath. They had to do it right there in the room because there wasn't enough room for her anywhere else. So we got to keep her all day long. And Misty, my very paranoid wife, told me, you watch her. There's too many kids in this hospital. They're going to mix our kid up. You follow her. Everywhere she goes, I want you with her. That's a true story. And I did, because I'm scared of my wife. But she sent me on this mission. And I was determined that if I accomplish anything in my life, they are not going to mix up my kid with another kid. So I followed her all through the hospital. Ended up coming back to the room, and that night, God imposed a question on me. I didn't know it was God then, but I was plagued with a question. For 9 months, she was in water. But if I put her back in water again, she'll drown. Why? All night long, I wrestled with that. The ultimate question, or the ultimate answer I came to